Hey, it's me, Rose La Fabi Loca, and we are going to take down white supremacy, one pendejo at a time. This is the Sabe podcast. Hello everyone, welcome back to the Sabe podcast, where we discuss social, political, and economic issues facing minorities in the present day. I hope you all enjoyed episode 11, where we discussed epigenetics and its role in modern day African American issues. If you haven't yet, please give it a listen and let me know what your thoughts are. Don't forget to subscribe and share if you care, as we address these world issues one pendejo at a freaking time. Also, if you would like to get more information and updates about the podcast, follow me on Instagram at Rose La Fabi Loca. So today we are going to be talking about the racist ass history of marijuana and the importance of getting on the same page about this topic, since it has such a polarizing view among different groups of people. I mean, I'm sure if you smoke weed or you don't, you have met someone that has a lot of negative things to say about it, right? I feel like I've heard every criticism in the book. It's a gateway drug, it's a lazy drug, people who smoke are dirty, lazy, have no ambition, are criminals, lose brain cells, drive recklessly, etc. Then on the opposite end of those arguments, I've heard it brings people together, it's the best thing that ever happened to them, they wish they would have done it sooner, they don't understand why everyone hates it, and they don't see themselves ever stopping despite its legal status in their state. I mean, in a world where this substance is so prevalent, whether it's in movies, music videos, photography, art, literature, etc., I think it's important to come into these conversations with actual base knowledge. This episode isn't going to be unpacking everything there is to know about marijuana, but we are going to address the base knowledge that I think even people who don't smoke should know about. You see, marijuana is something that continues to pop up on ballots across America, so it's only right that you do your research and understand what it is, where it comes from, how it works, and why it's illegal in the first place. So this podcast is about social, political, racial, and economic issues, sure, but it's also about enlightenment, opening up your mind to things that are usually things you will overlook or not go out of your way to understand. And a lot of people struggle with this component of their lives. A lot of us get caught up in our day-to-day routine. We wake up, possibly eat breakfast, go to work, school, come home, have dinner, maybe binge watch something, shower, go to bed, rinse and repeat, right? If you're doing this, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Maybe your schedule isn't exactly like that, but it's the same idea. Monotonous. The same stuff every single day. Going out with friends or going out to dinner is an occasion every time rather than just something built into your life. I'm not gonna lie, being an adult and managing all of that can be difficult. That is really what adulthood is: maturity and balance. Maturity in how you cope with your problems and with people, and giving balance to your work, your social life, and your responsibilities. And within that responsibilities category is a slew of things many tend to avoid like the freaking plague. Responsibilities are the portion of life where people seem to procrastinate the most in getting things done. You see, unless you're naturally an introverted person, going to work and having a social life are things you don't necessarily try to avoid like the plague. And I mean this in a general way, because of course there are people who have an issue with showing up to both places. But generally speaking, it's a lot easier to get yourself out of bed to go have mimosas with your girlfriends at a brunch spot than it is to get you to do the dishes or change your child's shit diaper. So in short, what I'm trying to stress to you is this: marijuana and a basic understanding of it is our responsibility as adults, as voting age people, to know about, because it's not going to stop being put on voting ballots, and it's not going to be something that people stop talking about, okay, until it's federally legal. And I'm going to say this much: no matter what your stance is on this subject, I'm saying it now, today, one day in the near future, listen carefully, one day in the near future, marijuana is going to be federally legal. And we need to understand the effects of that being the case accordingly. We need to stop making the mistake as Americans that we have made for the last several decades, which is walking into voting booths not understanding any of the things that are listed there, or like many people do, not voting at all because we are too lazy to understand what each item on the list means. We have to really be advocating for American life, because if you've ever experienced voting before, you know that a lot of potential laws that people try to push are clouded in confusing wording that can oftentimes be titled in a misleading way on purpose in order to get people who are not innate researchers to vote yes on it. So not only is marijuana extremely relevant of a subject of conversation, but it's also something that a lot of people don't know the origins of, and certainly don't know that its mere legality is steeped in racism. When we talk about marijuana, it shouldn't be talked about in the same kind of breath that we talk about something like, heroin, for example, and yet stubborn opposers continue to demonize the substance and perpetuate its racist undertone. So this episode has several key points that I want you to walk away with understanding. Things like marijuana's origins and its culture. Yes, there is a culture. Defining common terms like THC versus CBD versus hemp and what each does. The pros and cons of marijuana, present usage and its impact on the legal states and their economy. What America would look like with this being federally legalized, and why it matters, and how its mere legal status actually harms Black and Hispanic people. So let's begin by digging into the origins of marijuana. Now, my first real introduction into marijuana was actually my spring semester of my freshman year of college. I first attended the University of South Florida in Tampa shortly after graduating high school, and at that time I was majoring in criminology because I wanted to work for the FBI, and USF is the only school, or at least at that time, that was closer by my home and had a criminology major, so that's why I chose to go there. And in my introduction to criminal justice class, it was in a very large lecture hall, kind of like the ones you see on TV where you could literally bring a friend to the class and nobody would notice. And the way it was structured on a weekly basis, the professor would bring in guest speakers that worked in different sectors of the criminology umbrella. You see, criminology is very vast. It's not like a criminal justice major, which is very narrow. So with that kind of major, you could be anything from an airport security officer to an FBI or CIA agent. So with that being said, we had a lot of guest speakers with diverse backgrounds under that umbrella that would lecture us from that time period, and then we'd be quizzed about it virtually the next class. So the most memorable speaker for me was the guest speaker that was visiting from the Drug Enforcement Administration umbrella, and in that lecture, the guests discussed briefly marijuana, its history in the context of its legality, and what the future looks like. And this was even back in 2013. People in the law enforcement sector were coming forward to young hopefuls like myself, saying that the legalization of marijuana is inevitable. And at that time, a handful of states like Colorado were in serious talks about what the future would look like with legalization in their state. And subsequently, in January of the following year, in 2014, Colorado's government passed Amendment 64, which granted legal use of marijuana. What was the most striking to me about the lecture was the fact that in marijuana's very origins is a clear example of how the U.S. government and big business have a marriage that will never be broken. You see, outside of it being steeped in racism, meaning, marijuana history, as we're about to discuss, marijuana's very legal status has been brought to us by money and greed, just like a lot of things in this country. A lot of money is being made off of marijuana being illegal, and a lot of bodies who are otherwise a standard, non-harmful citizen in this country are in shackles in our prisons due to marijuana consumption and sale. So this is why it's important that we discuss this thoroughly, and by the end of this episode, you guys will really understand a lot more context to this conversation, and hopefully can decide where you stand on it with an educated opinion. So let's discuss marijuana. Marijuana, also known as cannabis, is a psychoactive drug that comes from the cannabis plant and is used for both medical and recreational purposes. Now, when we say psychoactive drug, that simply means that it is defined as a chemical substance that changes a person's mental state by affecting the way the brain and the nervous system operate. There are 4 categories of psychoactive drugs. There's depressants, opioids, stimulants, and hallucinogens. Now, we could literally talk all day just about this one topic of the different drugs within each category and their usage, but I want you guys to understand on a basic level that we are often raised to believe drugs are bad, right? Whether they're in the form of pills, smokable, injectable, drinkable, etc. And while sure it is argued how detrimental to us many drugs are, there are also drugs that we depend on like anesthesia, which is used for general surgery so you're not awake while they open your body up. Antidepressants, antipsychotics, anticonvulsants, etc., which those ones are all prescribed by physicians and other healthcare practitioners. So I'm just trying to challenge you guys. Like I say all that to say that really think high level, regardless of where your stance is. A lot of times I find when people go into this kind of conversation, they don't like marijuana. They're not thinking at a high level. And it's been all types of people. People that I know have the capacity to think, have high level thinking, use very low level thinking approaches to this topic, and it's kind of frustrating because it's like I want to have a real conversation about this because it does matter to me what people's perceptions of this thing is, because I don't get it. As someone who knows the history and knows all about it, who's done it, etc., I don't understand these arguments that people make, and it has to come down to ignorance. So it's like, if we're gonna have a debate, like, that's something about me that people have to understand. You could have a completely different opinion from me, and I could not agree with you, but I will respect your opinion more if I know that you've done your research and you're coming with the facts. Like, you're not, like, your opinion is based off of what you know to be the case, which means that when we have these debates and arguments, we really shouldn't be in a place where we're angry, because if something is a fact, that means that both of us, no matter what our stances are, whether we're pro or not pro of something, we should both have a overlap in opinion when it comes to the facts, because facts are facts, right? They are what they are. So if you're coming into a conversation with me and you're giving me things that are not facts, and I know that they're not facts because I know what the facts are and where to find them, where the resources are, I have a hard time respecting and entertaining your opinion, to be honest, because you're just talking shit. You know what I mean? Like, so that's just something about me that, as someone who does a lot of research, spends a good majority of their day researching all types of shit, from serious to not serious to funny to fucking depressing. As someone who does all that work, if you come into a conversation with me, at least fucking know what you're talking about, okay? Don't be like just straight opinionating the whole conversation with your ridiculousness. Anyways, now, by law, drugs, substances, and certain chemicals used to make drugs are classified into 5 distinct categories or schedules, depending upon the drug's acceptable medical use and the drug's abuse or dependency potential. So the abuse rate is a determinant factor in the scheduling of a drug. For example, Schedule 1 drugs are considered to have a high potential for abuse and the potential to create severe psychological and/or physical dependence. As the drug schedule changes, Schedule 2, Schedule 3, etc., so does the abuse potential. So Schedule 5 drugs represent the least potent for potential abuse. In the context of marijuana, and where its perception is most problematic, is in the fact that it is categorized as a Schedule 1 drug. So Schedule 1 drugs are defined as drugs with no currently accepted medical use and high potential for abuse. So the government currently puts marijuana into the same category as heroin, LSD, ecstasy, meth, and peyote. So already, marijuana being in that schedule doesn't make any sense, because there are, in fact, medicinal uses for marijuana, also known as medical marijuana, which is legal in 33 states at this time. So that being said, by definition, it should already be not able to be put into the Schedule 1 classification. And another part of that definition that doesn't make sense is the high possibility of dependency. So let's just note this. This is something you can research on your own. This is a fact, okay? This is not me just saying this. If you want a resource, you can go to verywellmind.com and it'll talk about this. But The majority of pot smokers do not develop a marijuana addiction, but some smokers do develop all the symptoms of an actual addiction after chronic marijuana use. So get this in your head, most marijuana users never come close to being addicted to weed. They do not lose control of its use. They generally use the amount they want to use and when they want to use it. When they use marijuana, they get the exact same results they expect and intend to. So there is a difference between marijuana abuse and marijuana dependence. Marijuana abuse occurs when someone continues to use the drug despite negative consequences, such as losing a job, poor academic performance, or getting arrested. Just as with other drug use disorders, people who continue to use marijuana in spite of continued negative consequences, by definition, have a marijuana use disorder. Someone who becomes addicted or dependent upon marijuana has a cannabis use disorder, but will also display some of the classic behavioral symptoms of addiction, like losing control, needing more and more and more of it. They'll spend all their time thinking about it. Their life will change in a negative way, and they'll just deny that that's the cause of it. The substance will become like the center of their lives. They spend time and money trying to get it, and they become irritable and agitated if they run out. And the negative consequences just get more and more, and they just continue to use. So most experts agree that dependence on a substance is accompanied by a build-up tolerance to that substance, requiring increasing larger amounts and withdrawal symptoms when someone stops using the substance. Most marijuana smokers do not experience either tolerance or withdrawal. So already we're talking about a very different situation than what is in that same Schedule 1 category, things like heroin and meth and stuff like that. So when we are having these conversations and you're having a conversation with someone who's anti-marijuana or whatever, or people who they teeter-totter on the border of like, I like medical marijuana, but I don't like the idea of recreational use. When you talk to people like that, a lot of them still have this notion in their heads that this is the same kind of discussion as heroin because of the fact that it has a Schedule 1 classification. And when they go to these jobs that are maybe government jobs, for example, government jobs are constantly training and brainwashing people to believe that marijuana is something to be demonized because of its Schedule 1 classification, because they're just teaching them the system that they have created. That doesn't mean that the system was correct. And this is something, again, like I always say again in this podcast, that like you have to think higher, you guys. Just because the government says something is something doesn't make it so. And if you don't see that for what it is, you have a serious problem on your hands, because this government does whatever the fuck it wants and it will make up rules as it goes along. So I understand that, if you have a government job, you have to follow the rules. I'm not saying that. I'm not saying, fuck the rules of your workplace. But what I'm saying is just because you get a training on drugs in the workplace or on marijuana in the workplace doesn't mean, it's coming from the government. So you have to not let yourself be so vulnerable to being like a doormat, basically, for this government. If you really want to have this conversation, if you really want to be informed, it's important to note that not all psychoactive drugs are equally harmful. Some are vastly detrimental to health, while others are actually things you can find in your own kitchen. For example, these are some drugs that are considered psychoactive: alcohol, amphetamines, cocaine, heroin, mushrooms, ecstasy, LSD, nicotine, and caffeine. Yes. Even caffeine is a psychoactive drug. Mind you, you can find it in coffee, tea, juices, sports drinks. It's those little nasty shots that they sell at the register in stores, etc. I mean, even sugar, to me, is a psychoactive drug. It's not considered one, obviously, on an official basis, the way caffeine is. But when you think about it, sugar, as we know it today, causes withdrawal symptoms, and it is addictive. It's highly addictive, and the government doesn't acknowledge that, which is why I say you cannot fuck with everything the government says. You guys gotta think higher, okay? Because the government is putting marijuana and alcohol and caffeine in this category, but America still runs on Dunkin' and the government loves putting this fucked up sugar in all of our food, keeping us addicted and keeping big businesses big. So like, come on, you know what I mean? Like, think higher. So let's discuss hemp and hemp seeds and cannabis, THC, all those terms that are thrown around all the time that people are like, I hear them, but I don't know what they mean. So cannabis or marijuana, those two words are interchangeable, has about 17% of THC. So THC is a psychoactive compound that makes you feel high, the part that gives you the psychoactive effect referenced earlier. So cannabis has medicinal and therapeutic uses for chronic pain, mental health, and illnesses. And this high can be accomplished through smoking via a glass bowl or rolled blunt or joint, a bong, vaporizers, G-pens, bubblers, steamrollers. You can ingest it via edibles, oils. They can be dabbed through a concentrated amount of THC. I mean, the list goes on and on. So marijuana is the plant, like cannabis plants. Cannabis, marijuana, again, interchangeable. And THC is what gives you the high. Now, there is also popular talk and consumption of something called CBD oil. Now, CBD oil is the oil that provides all the medicinal effects of marijuana without the psychoactive effects. So as far as the hemp plant goes, it is what can produce clothing, rope, paper, fuel, home installation, and much more. Hemp seeds don't have any THC, and they have no more than trace amounts of CBD, and the hemp seeds are cold pressed for oil production. So the oil can be used in cooking, like hemp seed milk and granola, beauty products, and even paint. So it's said that hemp has been utilized to make fabric since as early as 8000 BC. So this is nothing new, you guys. Mind you, the first use of marijuana for medicinal purposes was recorded in 2700 BC, just to give even more context to how humans have been using this for a long ass time. I mean, the earliest direct evidence for human consumption of cannabis as a drug has been discovered in a 2,500-year-old cemetery in Central Asia, according to research published today in the journal Science of Advances. So shout out to my motherfucking Asians out there for doing everyone a solid. Marijuana was said to have been an ingredient in a holy anointing oil referenced in the original Hebrew version of Exodus. So y'all Christians that be so up, I mean, I'm Christian too, but so be so up in arms about marijuana need to calm the fuck down. Marijuana is a plant from the earth, the same earth God created. So I really wish people would stop equating it with heroin like they're even remotely the same thing. And I blame the government for that and their schedules. Like, no one has ever died from a marijuana overdose. It is, in fact, impossible. Yet, heroin claims the lives of thousands every year. Like, what are we even talking about? Anyway, in the mid-1500s, the Spanish, people from Spain, you guys, not Hispanics, the Spanish, brought cannabis to the New World. So they intended to grow this crop for hemp, the strong fibers that could be used for clothes and bags, and most especially at that time for rigging of ships. So at this same time, African slaves were transported to Brazil, and they were able to grow crops of marijuana to smoke. Then around 1890, the hemp was replaced by cotton as a major cash crop in the south of the U.S. But it's also important to mention that the intoxicating properties of marijuana at that time were very low compared to what they are in present day. So where that began to change was in 1910 when people fled Mexico during that country's revolution and arrived in America with their cannabis. So in the late 1920s, there was a man, Victor Licata, that was living in Ybor City in Tampa, Florida, and he murdered his family with an axe. And at that time, cannabis was not illegal in America. And within the same time period, Harry Anslinger had taken over the Department of Alcohol Prohibition and the Federal Bureau of Narcotics right as alcohol prohibition was ending. So he inherited a situation where his department lost the war with alcohol prohibition and was going through a bunch of corruption at that time, and he wanted to maintain like a goal or some sort of momentum, to basically justify his entire purpose of having his position. So prior to this time, he stated that cannabis was not dangerous and didn't pose a threat to health, that it's not something that people should be worried about. And then he decided that cannabis was the most evil drug in the world and it was much worse than heroin. And he used the story of Victor Licata by partnering with the then Fox News of that time period called the Hearst newspapers. And he decided to announce that Victor Licata smoked cannabis and that was what led him to hack his whole family to death, and that behavior will be what happens if we allow cannabis to be widespread, basically inciting all-out fear into the public. And in that same time period again of that case happening was when cannabis was banned. So much later, a researcher actually went back into the case and found that in fact there was no evidence to suggest that Victor Licata was even a marijuana user to begin with in the first place. And backstory is that his family had been told to institutionalize him a year prior to them being murdered by him because he was severely mentally ill, and they decided to say fuck that and kept him home. Now, a little more background historically. Obviously, we have covered that this substance comes from the cannabis plant, but it wasn't until around the time when the Mexicans came to America during the Mexican Revolution that the Spanish word for the plant started catching on, thus birthing the often used Spanish term for cannabis, marijuana. So this was when the more sensationalized headlines about the drug started to appear in news articles. In 1936, a propaganda film called Reefer Madness was released, and in the movie, teenagers smoke weed for the first time, and it leads to these horrible events of hallucinations, attempted rape, and murder. So the media characterized this also as a gateway drug. So the following year, the Marijuana Tax Act was passed, and part of the reason the act was passed was because of the fact that Harry Anslinger was fear-mongering and basically being a huge instigator in all of the, all the people that were frightened by what could possibly happen if they smoked marijuana. So at this time was when racism and xenophobia really kicked in. And so Harry Anslinger connected this drug and its unscientific deduction of it being violent and hallucination inducing, and connected it with being Black and Hispanic. And so that created this perfect concoction for the whites to become up in arms about it. So by emphasizing the Spanish word marijuana instead of using the word cannabis, it perpetuated the connection between Mexican immigrants and the substance. So he also started another narrative that cannabis made Black people, quote, forget their place in society. And he pushed this idea that jazz was evil music and it was created by people that were under the influence of marijuana. So this is why you see in marijuana culture, Louis Armstrong was a really big figure, not only in the jazz music, but also in marijuana culture, because he was known publicly as a pro-marijuana user, and a lot of his music was influenced under marijuana, and so he really helped keep the culture alive, not only within the Black community, but just in marijuana culture itself, regardless of race and racial background. His relationship to it basically, and his figure in culture at that time was similar to me, like how I would describe Snoop Dogg is for our generation, where Snoop Dogg is that guy for us, where he's very open and honest about his marijuana use, and has always been that way and will always be that way. And he's Uncle Snoop. He's just part of the culture. So Louis Armstrong was kind of that as well at that time. So the discrimination they encouraged was evident in real numbers. In the first full year after the Marijuana Tax Act was passed, Black people were 3 times more likely to be arrested for violating drug laws than white people, and Mexicans were nearly 9 times more likely to be arrested. So by 1952, the Boggs Act was passed, and it made sentencing for drug convictions mandatory. So through the 1960s and 70s, while all of this, shit was going on with the drugs and stuff like that, and the government, basically the government versus the people, weed smoking took on new perception during the counterculture movement, where young white people resisted mainstream culture and that mainstream white culture, especially of that oppression, and they oppose powerful institutions. So this was known as the hippie era. So hippies were a really big part of keeping the marijuana culture alive, and like Louis Armstrong, have played a huge role in what marijuana culture is today. So despite the hippie era, though, laws continued to push the severity of the drug. The Controlled Substances Act of 1970 passed under Richard Nixon, and it repealed the Marijuana Tax Act, and instead was when they began to make marijuana a Schedule I drug. So criminalization still disproportionately affects minorities to this day. And in 2010, Black people were reported to be 4 times more likely to be arrested for marijuana possessions than white people, even though both groups consume marijuana at about the same rate. So individuals like Jeff Sessions have perpetuated anti-marijuana sentiments, like saying that good people don't smoke marijuana. That's what Jeff Sessions said. Or this Kansas State Representative, Stephen Alford, he made the case that was steeped in the same kind of old white man racism that Harry Anslinger began in the early 1900s. He deadass said, what you really need to do is go back in the 30s. The African Americans, they were basically users, and they basically responded the worst off drugs just because of their character makeup and their genetics. So we've already covered a lot already. We talked about the origin, some of its culture, the terms used in reference to marijuana, and how its illegal status harms Black and Hispanic people. So let's close with discussing present usage, weighing some of the more negative known facts, its impact in legal states, and what America would look like if we were to federally legalize marijuana. So there's this really great book called Chasing the Scream, The First and Last Days of the War on Drugs, and it's written by Johann Hari. And in that book, he digs into marijuana's past, and he makes the argument that originally, before his research, he just assumed that people back then in the 1920s were concerned about marijuana for the same reasons they say today, like they don't want children to become addicted and are worried about those effects on society. But actually, upon doing research into its origins, he found that those kinds of reasons were actually never brought up at all. Because in reality, the prohibition of marijuana was based in racial panic, xenophobia, and falsely widespread hysteria about what was going to happen if you smoked marijuana. So the United States since then has spent $1 trillion and counting on the war on drugs, and has mass incarcerated millions of Black and brown people and destroyed entire countries like Colombia. So Johann Hari posed the question of what happens when you criminalize cannabis and other drugs. And I love this because, one, it doesn't go away, obviously. We should all know that well enough. But in fact, it goes from legal licensed businesses to armed criminals, which creates a black market drug culture that operates under completely different and more violent rules than that of a licensed legal business. And I love the example he made where he says, the CEO of Budweiser wouldn't go and shoot the face of the CEO of Heineken, and your local liquor store doesn't send people to go stab people working in the nearby bar because they're their competition. Exactly those things were happening during the alcohol prohibition, because when you ban drugs, they have to operate in an illegal market. Illegal markets can only operate under violence. For example, if you walk into a liquor store right now and steal a bottle of vodka, they're going to call the cops, and the cops will find and arrest you. A drug dealer doesn't have that option because marijuana is illegal, right? So he has to add that extra layer of security and insurance to be sure that the product he's selling comes back as a profit. So that person would have no choice but to fight. And as a drug dealer, you don't want to have to continue fighting people every day, all day long. So you have to establish a reputation that makes people frighten you, so they wouldn't be so bold as to come and steal from you. So when you have drug prohibition, you create a market that functions under its illegal status, which adds a premium to the cost of the product the more violent that you are, because you have to be violent in order to protect your market in this business. So when you legalize, all of that goes away. So a lot of people use the argument that we can't legalize cannabis because what's used today is much more potent than what was used back in the early to mid 20th century. And though that is true that it is more potent, that's just the end result of cannabis prohibition. For example, just before alcohol prohibition was in place, the most popular drinks were beer and wine. When alcohol was banned, you couldn't get a hold of beer and wine anywhere. So the most popular drinks were moonshine and whiskey. So why is that? Why would banning a drug change the form of the drug? Well, Johan Hari gives another great example of this. Imagine if we had to smuggle enough alcohol to a local bar from the Mexican or Canadian border. If we fill the wagon with beer, we have enough to drink for 100 people. If we smuggle whiskey, which is much stronger per ounce, we'll have enough drinks for 1,000 people. When you ban drugs, there's a premium on getting the biggest possible kick into the smallest possible space because it has to be smuggled, right? It has to be transported in secret. And this happens with all drugs. This is why cannabis is more potent today than it was back in the early 20th century. So the most popular form even of getting cocaine before it was illegal was in coca tea and Coca-Cola. Yeah, Coca-Cola the soda. So the most popular way of consuming opioids was a drink called Miss Winslow's Soothing Syrup. And then they disappeared and the most popular form became heroin. So when you ban a drug, only the most extreme forms become available. There's a story from a police officer that Johan Hari referenced where the police officer was sent to stake out a drug dealer, and he was obviously dressed in plain clothing, and a kid about 12 to 13 years old came up to him and said, "Can you buy me alcohol from that liquor store there, because I can't buy it for myself?" And of course the undercover cop was like, "What? No, get out of here." So the kid goes across the street to the drug dealer, and the drug dealer sells him some drugs instead. So the cop has this epiphany where he's like, duh. He realized it's actually in our best interest, if you truly care about keeping drugs away from your kids, which you should, because cannabis in particular has been linked to negatively impacting the development in kids under 18, then you should vote to decriminalize it so the power goes into the hands of legal licensed businesses that have something to lose by selling to kids, rather than a drug dealer who doesn't care what age his customer is as long as he's making money. All of the research indicates that in places where drugs are decriminalized, there's a fall in drug cartels and fall in teenagers using, and a massive increase in tax revenue. It's not a perfect science, of course. There's always going to be kinks to fix along the way, but at least if it was legal federally, we could actually have the power to fix things as we go. We have zero control over illegal markets and how they operate. Like, even the president of Switzerland made the case to the Swiss people regarding the legalization of heroin, saying, quote, "When you hear legalization, everyone automatically thinks of anarchy and chaos. But what we have now is anarchy and chaos. We have unknown criminals selling unknown chemicals to unknown drug users, all in the dark, all filled with violence. Legalization is the way that we restore order to this chaos. At some point, we have to look at the results because they've worked incredibly well. Let's look at the places that have maintained not legalizing drugs. How well is that working out for you?" And just for social reasons, prohibition of marijuana is unwarranted government intrusion into individuals' freedom of choice. And marijuana is no more harmful to a person's health than alcohol or tobacco, which are both legal and widely used as well as regulated by the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. And not for nothing, but alcohol and tobacco, I would argue, are way more dangerous than someone smoking marijuana, because we already know what fucking happens to you when you smoke cigarettes. And marijuana has proven medical benefits for patients suffering from a host of ailments and diseases, including cancer, including AIDS, including glaucoma, including Crohn's disease, including so many things, anxiety, depression, etc. And crime and violence, both within the U.S. and at the U.S.-Mexico border, are greatly increased because of the fact that there's illegal selling and buying of marijuana. So legalization would logically end the need for such criminal behavior, like I said before. And just for like fiscal economy shit reasons, marijuana is one of America's top selling agricultural products. According to the Colorado Department of Revenue, combined 4-year sales of marijuana for that state since it legalized cannabis in 2014 has now topped $7.6 billion. If marijuana were legalized and regulated, the industry could generate up to $106.7 billion annually for local, state, and federal governments. And some estimates say that the government spends $29 billion annually on drug prohibition alone, and that this too could be saved by legalizing marijuana. If you would have legalized marijuana, then everybody would have been able to have several stimulus checks and the government would not be crying broke like it is right now. So take all this information in and recognize what really is a true opinion of marijuana legalization. I have a hard time with a lot of people in my network with this because it's like all of their reasons for not wanting it to be legal are steeped in the same baby boomerisms with how they were raised, and it's just frustrating because it's like, are you even trying to understand the facts about this, or are you just content with pushing this issue back further and further? Because like I said, marijuana is set to become federally legal eventually. This country has gone from a 16% approval rating of legalization 30 years ago to 59% in modern times. So clearly, it's come down to being a matter of politics. The fact of the matter is, marijuana was made illegal for racist and xenophobic reasons, as well as leaving a huge market open for big tobacco companies to push the sale of cigarettes. And we all know how that went left. So again, how many times does the government need to fuck us over in every category before we wake up and are like, wait a second, just because the FBI says something is bad doesn't necessarily make it bad. They are just operating within the laws the government has created, and those laws are created by people who are racist and xenophobic in nature, and they get put in those seats in the first place because of voters like us. So I ask you, who are the real clowns here, the politicians or us? Because they're like 20 steps ahead of us at all times, and we are constantly chasing down problems instead of getting in front of them, and the war on drugs is no different. So, anyways, I hope you all enjoyed this episode and learned something new. Please join me next Tuesday at 10 a.m. when we discuss minorities' toxic glorification of the family unit. It's going to be a great one and really insightful to people of color, so I will see you then. Don't forget that you can follow me on Instagram for updates and more informational tidbits at Rose La Fabuloca, and also don't forget to hit the subscribe button on the Apple Podcast app and YouTube to get notifications when I upload new episodes. I hope you all have a wonderful weekend, and I will speak to you all next week. Bye!